Professor Whyte was the Foundation Professor in the Graduate School of Librarianship at Monash University. The work of the school is now incorporated within one of the schools within the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University. But Jean and her sister Phyllis left a very generous bequest to Monash to support research in librarianship, records, archives, and to support the library's research collection in English literature, librarianship and philosophy. Tonight we are very privileged to have a most prominent speaker for the 2012 Whyte Memorial Lecture. Anne-Marie Schwirtlich took up her appointment as Director General of the National Library of Australia in March 2011. Between February 2003 and February 2011, she was Chief Executive Officer and State Librarian at the State Library of Victoria. So these are very old, happy stomping grounds, I'm told, by Anne-Marie for her. So it's wonderful to have her back again in Melbourne. In 2006, she was seconded for 6 months to act as the Director of Arts Victoria, the Victorian Department of the Arts. In the period 2000 to 2003, Anne-Marie was the Acting Director General of the National Archives of Australia, having previously held senior positions at that institution, the National Library and the Australian War Memorial. Anne-Marie has also taught at the University of Canberra and at the University of New South Wales, where she completed her postgraduate work in archives management. Anne-Marie has been active in professional associations in Australia and internationally, and she has published widely. Tonight, Anne-Marie will be speaking on the topic, the challenges of the digital era. Is the merger of libraries with archives one of them? Anne-Marie, I'm very much looking forward to your presentation tonight. I've been a long-time member of the university's library committee, and I see all the challenges that confront the library in this day and age. So I hope to learn much off you tonight and to take back to Catherine Harbour-Reid what we might do within the university library at Monash. So without further ado, would you please join with me in extending a warm welcome to Anne-Marie to deliver the 2012 Whyte Memorial Lecture.
Good evening to the admirers of Professor Jean Whyte, friends and colleagues. I should like to thank Professor Ron Webber, the Dean of the Faculty of Information Technology, for extending to me the honour of delivering the 2012 Whyte Memorial Lecture. Jean Whyte, whom we celebrate through the lecture, often referred to herself as an accidental librarian. She grew up on a sheep station north of Port Augusta, completing her primary school education by weekly packages of lessons, returned to the South Australian Education Department's correspondence courses section, and then attended St. Peter's Collegiate Girls' School for her secondary schooling. As her father was not a convert to the benefits of educating women, and as he considered Jean a useful stockman, she had returned to the sheep station following school. She was, however, determined to go to university. She said that she fixed on the objective of a job at the Public Library of South Australia, not because she had conceived a burning ambition to be a librarian, but rather because it was adjacent to the university. And so she began her library career in June 1942 in the Country Lending Service. In 1946, she completed her library qualifications, attaining the qualifying certificate of the Library Association. In 1952, after years of part-time study, she earned a Bachelor of Arts with first-class honours in English. In commenting on Jean's achievement, Harrison Bryan, who was university librarian to both Queensland and Sydney universities and Director General of the National Library, wrote, and I quote, "Honours degrees are difficult enough to secure with full-time study." He said that only workaholics can manage them part-time, and that only brilliant workaholics can collect first-class honours under such conditions. In 1948, Jean Whyte began her career as a teacher of librarians, becoming the staff personnel and training librarian at the State Library of South Australia. She was rigorous, she was tough and inspiring. She cared deeply about the standards and intellectual framework for the profession, and over the years combined her professional practice with oversight of the Library Association's certification of education and extensive writing and editing. My pragmatic interest in the independence or the merging of archives and libraries arises for two simple reasons. The first is that twice over the years I have been a chief executive, I have been asked by the secretary of my portfolio department to consider a merger. On both occasions, I argued against the proposal. The second reason for my interest is that nationally and internationally, we have witnessed recently declarations of intent to merge archives and libraries. And so this has happened in Ireland, in the Netherlands, and in Singapore. Libraries and Archives Canada merged in 2004, and in many ways I think is an organisation that is still evolving intellectually and practically. If such a suggestion, i.e. that the National Library and the National Archives were to merge, were to be put to David Fricker, who is the Director General of the National Archives, and to me, or to our respective councils, what grounds and what evidence might we adduce to refute or discuss the proposal? In a posting dated to the 3rd of January this year, following the announcement in the Netherlands, Chris Hurley, a distinguished Australian archivist, commented, "Archivists should be developing a response to such mergers that goes beyond mere opposition." To develop such a response, I think we need to consider what makes library and archives mergers attractive and to whom. An examination of the documentation published in Ireland, in the Netherlands, and in Singapore might give us evidence in support of mergers, or at least why they are considered attractive. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to go through what has been said in those jurisdictions about the impetus for merging. In November last year, the Irish government's statement about its public service reform plan included announcement of a new and expanded program of state agency rationalisation of 48 such bodies by the end of 2012, with a further 46 to be critically reviewed by June this year. The statement or the plan said, these measures will deliver enhanced service efficiencies together with ensuring a more focused and democratically accountable public service. Elsewhere in the document, it says the government believes that real benefit will come from a less crowded administrative landscape, resulting in greater accountability, less duplication of effort, and clearer lines of responsibility for citizens. The rationalisation of bodies includes, this is in Ireland, includes the merging of the National Archives and the Irish Manuscripts Commission into the National Library while maintaining separate identities, and I quote. I don't know what that means, but that's what it said. The rationalisation also requires the examination of shared services between the National Library and the National Museum and the board structure of both bodies. So it really is a very sweeping approach to rationalisation. The allure of lean government was also cited in December last year when it was announced that the National Archives and National Library of the Netherlands were to be integrated into one organisation. The public statement said, "The integration is a logical continuation of the substantial cooperation between both institutions, and it is in line with the aim of Cabinet to make the government more compact." The decisions about rationalisation in Ireland were sweeping, and they were accompanied by budget cuts of round about 40% for each institution across the board. In the Netherlands, it seemed to be a boutique level decision arising from the considerable existing collaboration between the National Library and the National Archives, but there was an aim to improve services. The official statement goes on to say, "Customers of both national institutions may expect even better because more well-coordinated services." In Singapore, there is a dearth of information, save for one-line press reports to the effect that the National Archives of Singapore and the National Library Board will merge in the wake of a decision to distribute the portfolio responsibilities of 2 ministries between 3, with the merged body to be in the Ministry of Communications and Information. So if ministers, governments, treasuries cite as reasons for mergers promoting efficiency, building on synergies, leaner or more compact government, reducing silos, and improved quality of service to citizens, what is it they want, and is there a subtext? In thinking about and in preparing this presentation, I either met or I corresponded with colleagues in the Netherlands, in Singapore, and in Ireland. They were very generous with their observations and with their advice, and I want to treat it scrupulously, and so there are going to be elements of what I say that are completely anonymised for that reason. The argument that we want to have a more compact government, from the perspective of a minister, from the perspective of a treasury, from the perspective of central service agencies, what might that mean? I think that some of the subtext here is that probably around the world there is a view that government has become extremely complicated. Government has become extremely demanding, and that every independent organisation is, in fact, one more mouth to feed. It is conceivably yet another piece of legislation to worry about or to deal with. Probably it's an inconsistent piece of legislation. One of the things that I have noted in my life as a CEO are the excitements periodically about harmonising legislation, which basically means, why can't you all just be the same? And I think there is also a view that there are so many CEOs, there are so many chairmen of councils, all of them with bold visions or aspirations, and all of them accompanied by a begging bowl and an ask for more. I think one of the other factors that we see at play with this trend or popularity for merging institutions is that it can provide either certain politicians or indeed senior civil servants with the opportunity to build their public brands or to build their political profiles along the lines of being crusading reformers and actually helping to get government right. They might work far better together. And the initial proposal that those two institutions went to government with was, in fact, for investment in the two institutions in order to assist them to collaborate better. And at first, that was seen as a very persuasive argument. But whether it was part of the political cycle in the Netherlands or whether it was part of the budgetary cycle in the Netherlands, that very soon turned from, well, if collaboration is good, merger must be much, much better. And from talking about investing in the two institutions to talking about what the possibilities of savings are from the two institutions. I think one of the other things that is that underpins some of the discussion about mergers is no understanding or a lack of understanding of why in a digital world archives and libraries are different. The convergence of format is, I think, actually dissolving the understanding of the missions or the purpose of the institutions. And there are aspects of the work that libraries and archives do, I think in the area of preservation, for example, and to some extent possibly in the areas of making material discoverable or accessible, where there is indeed a great deal that we might do together. These political and administrative imperatives or confusions are no doubt also evident in the public mind. Nat Torkington, a New Zealand commentator, in a paper titled "Where It All Went Wrong," said to members of the National and State Libraries Australasia group last year, "The internet, led by Google, is the start and end of most people's research. It's good enough to meet their needs, which is great news for the casual researcher, but it's bad news for you. Now, they don't think of you," that is, National and State Libraries, "at all. Oh yes, I know all the reasons why the web and Google are no replacement for a healthy research library. I know the critical importance of documentary heritage, but it's not me you're talking to at budget time. It's the public through the politicians." So I think the blurring is a blurring both on the minds of our political masters, our administrative colleagues, and a significant part of the public. So I've touched on why I think mergers of libraries and archives might be seen to be attractive in certain quarters. The question I have also asked myself is, do mergers offer anything to archives and libraries themselves? I think that there are instances around the world where, depending on the legal basis on which the library or the archives is constituted, because they can differ, that it is possible that a merger could offer one or other of the institutions independence if one or other of them is deeply embedded in a departmental structure. It is possible that you could argue that by combining two organisations, you actually have an organisation with a far larger critical mass that might be able to deploy its resources in strikingly different ways by making savings. I think it would be fair to say in some jurisdictions that the merger of a library and an archives provides, and probably it's the library in this case, with far more access to original content. And if original content is going to be the future, you can see why that might be attractive. Depending on the respective financial situations of either an archives or a library, it's possible to see that the poorer of the organisations might feel that it would be getting access to money, to capability, and possibly to real estate. I think that there is also the capacity in such mergers, or for such mergers, to offer the respective partners in the marriage the opportunity to learn from each other in a fundamental root and branch way that does not happen if you've got two institutions collaborating. And I guess that ought to lead us to think about what is it that libraries do better and what is it that archives do better, and therefore what can we learn from each other. I think it would be possible to argue that mergers of archives and libraries might also lead to better services for the public, or at least integrated services for the public. In Quebec, where there was indeed a marriage of the two organisations, one of the comments that is made is that readers have benefited significantly from this. The evidence that is adduced for this, for it being better for readers, is that combined reading rooms provide a single stream of service, and that is simpler, and that possibly combining delivery services will also lead to far better services to the public. I actually think that combining reading room services is spending too much effort and too much worry on physical infrastructure, given that I think our future concerns and strategies ought to be all around the digital. Nat Talkington, whom I mentioned earlier in the presentation I mentioned earlier, said that he divided library services into three areas: collecting, discovery, and delivery. And I'll quote another bit of his comments to us. He said, "In the paper world, your work and your thinking was dominated by the challenges of collection and discovery. So librarians have incredible expertise in preserving words on reeds, on calf skins, on pulped trees. There's huge mana in having a big collection. Delivery is the runt of the litter in the paper world. And you offer crap access. I look at the results of those digitisation projects. I find the shittiest websites on the planet. It's like a gallery spent all its money buying art and then just stuck the painting in supermarket bags and leaned them against the wall. You can argue until you're blue in the face," he said, "about the intrinsic value of collections. But as your research monopoly has been destroyed, you need to start delivering some other value. And access to those precious collections is it." this indictment of library websites applies, I would argue, just as much to archives websites. And if we are thinking about the future, we need to be thinking about discovery and delivery. And this is where I think one of the other arguments for mergers are put to us by our political masters, and it's around the area of digitising, because we are seen as digitising shops. And so why have two digitising shops if it would be a whole lot more efficient to just have one? But I would argue that in the discovery and delivery of e-materials, e-records, e-content, what is actually going to be absolutely crucial is our ability to describe context. And that is something that archivists have worried about for time immemorial. And I think that as libraries are capturing huge amounts of electronic material, that understanding and that communication, documentation and communication of context is going to be crucial. But I wouldn't let archives off the hook here, because I actually think that over the decades, archives have become worse at documenting context and communicating it in a way that is useful to researchers. I would argue that independence of archival institutions enables those institutions to prosecute, first of all, to secure and prosecute their legislative mandate. And certainly in government jurisdictions around this country and others, having a legislative mandate for archives is crucial. Independence for archives means that archival institutions are able to provide advice to their jurisdictions, normally government jurisdictions, on the creation, on the management, and on the appraisal of records to support the business needs of government, to support citizens' rights, to support decision-making, and to support accountability. I think that independence enables archival institutions to support the efficiency of record keeping in their government jurisdictions and to actually do research and write policy for that. And it also provides a framework for rights of access and to support research, to support education, and to support enjoyment in the use of archives. I think that independence for archival institutions also enables the archives to allocate and prioritise resources available to it to best meet their legislative missions. And so in terms of libraries, if there are mergers, what might be the risks? What is it that I think we need to preserve through independence? And I would say, and here I'm thinking about the National Library just as an example, that it is about preserving the independence and capacity to select and to document, to manage the published output of our jurisdiction, which is Australia. It is to select, it is to commission, it is to document, and it is to make accessible records and other materials that document Australia and Australians. It is to ensure that we can provide Australians with access to the world's knowledge and information. It is to enable us to provide infrastructure services, utilities, leadership to elements of the library community in the country or in jurisdictions. And it is to enable the library, in the same way as I said it enables the archives, to allocate and prioritise the resources available to it to best meet its mission. And so if we are to make a case for distinct archives and library institutions, what ought we to do? What do we need to do? And probably I should say here that I don't believe that at the Commonwealth level, at any rate, at the moment, there is any great interest or desire in merging the archives, the library, or any one of us with anybody else. But that's not to say that international precedents won't garner attention here. So I think that to be ready to argue a case that is more than opposition or blanket opposition, that we need to be able to restate some of the points that I've made above, and that we need to make the argument that independence is not an impediment to efficiency or accountability. I think we need to be accountable and responsive, and that we need to have the evidence to back this up, and we need to have the reputation for being accountable and responsive. And we need to be able to talk about it just as part of our daily discourse with ministers and others. I think we need to develop data about the cost of merging, and I think we also need to develop data or business cases about how long it will be before you see savings, if there are indeed savings to be found. And the work that our colleagues overseas are going through ought to provide us with terrific case studies as well. I also think that we need to collaborate across the collecting sphere where we possibly can. And I think we need to have a really eloquent way of talking about that collaboration and its impact. And we have to be able to expose this very, very broadly. And the last thing I'd say about what I think we need to be ready to do is to do some strategic planning or some scenario modelling about what we see the future of libraries and archives as, and whether there are areas that we think we could work more closely on while still preserving that which is distinct, but actually doing the intellectual work of strategic planning and of scenario modelling, complicated though it is, demanding though it is, would be a really worthwhile investment. One of the things that I would observe is that our professional arguments for independence and distinct missions, which we've evolved over decades and refined very, very carefully, are arguments that we need to be very careful about deploying in what I would call the political or administrative sphere, because I think the chances are that they will look too much like special pleading or indeed not be easily understood. These are political decisions very often, or financial decisions very often, and I think they need to be argued and they need to be contested on those grounds more often than not. Another way, perhaps, of putting that as I close is to say that many, many years ago, Jean Whyte was very critical of the person who became the principal librarian of South Australia in 1955. She said of that august person, and I quote, "No morals, only politics." And I suspect that when we think about mergers of libraries and archives and why they are often introduced onto the political and administrative landscape, we could invoke Professor Whyte's phrase of that it's probably done without concern for not so much morality, but perhaps the rationale is not a very strong philosophical rationale, it is a political one. May I thank you very much for your company this evening, and I look forward to your questions, to your comments, and to your conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Casey. I'm not an archivist or a librarian, but I would like to know the places, countries that have merged. Are they mergers of equals and the outcome as two equal parts, or is it archives subsumed into the library?
I've been asked to represent the question for the purposes of our recording, and Irene's question is about the jurisdictions in which archives and libraries have merged and whether those mergers have been of equal parties or whether there has actually been a subsuming of one under the other. The best way I can respond is to say that I think there are very strong perception issues that are always at play with such mergers, and then there are probably more evidence-based ways of making an assessment. The merger that has been underway for longest is the merger in Canada between the National Library of Canada and the National Archives of Canada. And the perception issue that I talked about, I'll go to first, because for the first few years after that merger, if I spoke to colleagues from the archival side, they would all say to me, "It's terrible. The only bits of the organisation getting any attention and any resources are the library side." If I asked library colleagues, they would say the opposite. And that tells us a great deal about the extraordinary sensitivity and skills needed to effect any kind of merger, but particularly a merger in a space where there are really strong philosophical reasons for perhaps preserving the independence. To go to the other part of your question, which is, has there been a subsuming or were there equal partners? The National Archives of Canada was a far larger organisation than the National Library of Canada, far larger. And the work that is underway at the moment, if you read Dr. Caron's writings and you speak to him, he talks about inventing a completely new institution that has its feet in neither any longer, but has its intellect soaring in a different space. I can't tell you what that soaring might look like, because when I spoke to Dr. Caron in August this year, he was about to produce new documentation setting out this way of thinking. And that's why I said I think even though that is an organisation that is 8 years down the track, it is still very much a work in progress. Joanne? Yes. Next.
Joanne Evans from Monash University, Faculty of IT Lecturer. My question is the agenda you've put forward for the evidence base. What role should we be playing as academic educators and education to actually support the development of that agenda?
The question from Joanne was about as academic educators, what kind of role might she and colleagues play in developing the evidence base that I said we might need in the future. First of all, I guess I'd like to say, Joanne, thank you very much for the offer. And I certainly, I think it's a series of research questions that if we could have on the table for those doing further research, be they candidates for senior degrees or be they for colleagues on faculty. I think it would be really, really interesting to keep tabs on what is happening in international jurisdictions and to think about developing case studies from them, if that's possible. There is, of course, going to be a lot of information as they work their way through their mergers that possibly they're not in a position to share. I think that some of the work around what I would call the philosophical or the professional argument for independence is one that colleagues in the academic area would be fantastically well placed to articulate and to perhaps test those statements against some of the political statements that are made about the rationale. So there's a lot of talk about, accountability. You'll be more accountable if you're one organisation. Why? You will undoubtedly be more efficient if you're one organisation. Why? It's testing some of that I think would be incredibly useful.
At the end of your talk, you talked about having an elegant way of presenting ourselves. I think you exemplified that very well tonight. Thank you very much. Your syntax and structure of your talk has been quite alive. A couple of quick things. The difference between libraries and archives in the context of access and so on, there seem to be very different criteria there, and I was very glad you touched on that. We could go on that about that for ages. And then the question of context, I really find that fascinating because the environment changes and the perception of the environment changes. But let me just ask you one question, and this applies, I think, both to and to national libraries, National Archive and National Libraries. Given the digitisation, the library, so let's talk about NLA. The library now has a global presence as well as a physical presence in Canberra. How do you see the politicians viewing this, and in their view, economics should feature?
By politicians, and your question then was about the economics.
Well, I think politicians are going to be interested in the economics very largely.
Of that. So to go to the question about how is the National Library's digital presence viewed through a political prism. We are in the arts portfolio, and our minister is Simon Crean, who is both Minister for the Arts and Minister for Regional Australia. And I think we're extraordinarily fortunate because he sees the digital accessibility, digital services, digital presence as being precisely what the national collecting institutions ought to be doing, and that's partly because of his interest in regional Australia and services to regional Australia. It's partly because of his interest in having collections exposed and accessible, and his encouragement to us is one of his favourite phrases is, "I want you all to join the dots." He uses it a lot. There are times I don't know quite which dots he'd like us to be joining, but it is strong political support for ensuring that he can make an argument to his cabinet colleagues about the arts together, or about collecting institutions together, not just about them seriatim, one at a time. And he, for example, last year said that he wanted to help us to help him to make that argument, and asked us to work with some consultants to try to develop high-level indicators of impact, so that when he's sitting around the cabinet table or when he's giving speeches, he can actually use those kinds of indicators. And we've spent a year trying to do just that. The National Library is very fortunate because Simon Crean, as our minister, can tell you stories about Trove or anecdotes about Trove at the drop of a hat. And I was delighted to, I think this week, send him off to a visit to India with the statistic that 24% of the usage of Trove comes from India. And so the resources accessible through Trove about Australia are extraordinarily heavily used in places that I think it would be fair to say we did not think our usage would come from, when Trove was developed. I think that the arguments we've been able to make about the way that Trove has not only made research more efficient, but the Trove has changed the way that it is possible to do research, have been arguments that he's taken to with gusto. So I believe that at the moment, in the political frame in which we're operating, there is strong political awareness, and of course the endless challenge, or my job, is to ensure that it is articulated wherever I go to everyone I meet, so that there is as broad support as possible for it. I think a part of your question touched on the economics of it all, and the investment that the National Library has made in a service like Trove, which was an investment that was made without external funding. But it's interesting that in the Commonwealth budget of May this year, the Minister did actually secure funding for all of the collecting institutions at the national level to assist them with their access and accessibility work.
Is there a final question, please?
Would any of the proposed mergers generate new employment or new positions within the country in which it takes place? Because if it doesn't, it just really converts government expenditure from the form of wages into unemployment benefit, and it makes the people that lose their positions functionless. And if you just expand that out through society, people are just up in dental chairs watching TV and pecking away at computer screens.
I have not done an analysis of staffing figures in Canada, which, as I say, has had merged institutions for 8 years. But in Ireland, whether they were to merge or not, there is a 40% cut across most of the Irish public sector, and that undoubtedly will translate into the loss of jobs. It's too early to know in Singapore. It is not being talked about as a savings mechanism, and the Netherlands, we are still to see how things will develop there.
Could I now invite Mr. Shane Carmody, Director of Development for the State Library of Victoria, to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you, Shane.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Anne-Marie, it's been lovely to have you back at the State Library, and it's wonderful to contemplate some of the issues that you've so thoughtfully presented to us. Anne-Marie knows only too well that I personally kind of merge libraries and archives. I worked at the National Archives here in Melbourne for 6 years and then came to the State Library of Victoria. And when I was at the National Archives as a colleague of Anne-Marie's, and soon after I was a colleague of Anne-Marie's here at the library. So the merging happens, although not quite in the way that our politicians might think. The issues that Anne-Marie raised tonight, I think, provoke some interesting questions for us around jurisdiction. And one of the things that I was contemplating as Anne-Marie was speaking was that in legislative terms, archives, particularly government archives, are generally established as evidentiary base for our democratic rights, only subsequently evidentiary base for our historical imagination. Whereas in a library, we have rather broader and different purposes, perhaps. And the question that John raised about access and difference in access, I think, is very cogent here, because in a political sense and in a legislative sense, to secure your academic rights, your democratic rights, a legislative regime is necessarily part of a legislative access regime is necessarily part of an archives legislation. whereas the kinds of archives that we collect here, say in our manuscripts collection and the National Archives collects in their manuscripts collection, are private papers and often governed by quite strict restrictions. A case in point, indeed one very close to my heart here at this library and that has some resonance for the National Library, was the recent revelation of some possibly uncomfortable correspondence that resides in this library in the Santa Maria collection, where the current opposition leader was contemplating joining the other side. And this was alluded to in a publication, and when I met one of the sons of his correspondent, indeed someone who has chaired the National Archives Advisory Council, Paul Santa Maria, he was a bit upset to think that the very careful provisions that he had put in place to ensure that such things didn't happen had been breached, the confidence had been breached. Well, I reassured him that we kept very careful records of all the people who'd possibly read this material, and when we went back through these records, we couldn't work out who would have had the contact with the journalist who wrote the piece. And journalists, as we all know, will never reveal their sources, so it remains a mystery. But whether or not there's a democratic purpose for an archive or whether there's a democratic purpose for a library, in the end, I think the different imaginations that are brought to bear in both aspects of our profession are very important and very lively things for discussion. I suspect Jean Whyte would have seen this conversation as being just as interesting when she was practicing her craft as we do now, and it is a very important thing for us to be able to articulate a difference. So Anne-Marie, this evening I think you did that very well for us, and you've helped us understand through some of your international perspectives and your place of leadership in the library community and your opportunity to talk to people going through those changes, to understand what those differences could well mean. We're indebted to you in your leadership of the profession and in the way that you have helped, I think, Simon Crean understand how important libraries and archives are. And I hope that whoever you get to persuade next will be equally beguiled by your charms and your wit and your intelligence and undoubtedly, as John said, your excellent syntax. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Anne-Marie for her wonderful lecture. And
Thank you very much, Shane. Just a few closing matters, if I could please. First of all, an advertisement. If you're interested in it, you shouldn't allow a dean up on the stage at the end. Here's an advertisement for the faculty. I had the privilege of working with a wonderful group of colleagues who are very enthusiastic. We meet frequently and they give me great counsel and have great ideas. So I'd just like to thank them, if I could please. So first of all, Dr. Brian McMullen, who is the trustee for the Jean Whyte Foundation. So Brian, thank you very much for all your work. Professor John Crossley, thanks John for all your work. Professor Sue McKemish, who's currently overseas and tends her apologies for tonight, but Sue is a wonderful colleague to have on the committee as well. Becky Rakovich, who's down the front here somewhere. Becky, thanks Becky, thank you. And Ms. Celine Bola, who's very much behind the organisation of tonight. So Celine, thank you very much for all your assistance as well. A couple of people who assisted with the organisation for tonight, in particular Nicole Morgan and Eric Chang. Thank you to Nicole and Eric for all the assistance that they've given tonight. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people here. I hope, like me, you very much enjoyed the lecture, and we look forward to seeing you back at the lecture again next year. And finally, a thank you to Anne-Marie for a wonderful presentation of the Jean Whyte Memorial Lecture, the Whyte Memorial.